Good afternoon and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Emily Galvin-Almanza. The Rochester, New York police have been in the news a lot lately, and not for any good reason. Last year, officers in that department killed Daniel Prude. And I'm going to talk about what they did to him, but we've all, at this point, had to experience so much violence through the news that I want to put a little content warning on this, that what I'm about to describe is violent and horrifying. But in Rochester last March, police on the scene were seen handcuffing Mr. Prude, a black man who was naked and apparently in the midst of a mental health crisis. And they put a mesh bag over his head, they kneeled on his back, and they pushed his face into the ground until he stopped breathing. Rochester officials then fought for more than 4 months to keep the public from seeing body camera footage of that arrest. And eventually they complied with an open records request that would expose the department's, the word disturbing does not begin to cover it, the department's conduct here, and it would ignite protests across the city and beyond. And amid that backlash, Rochester's police chief announced his resignation before being fired a short time later by the mayor, Lovely Warren. Then in February, Rochester police once again drew national scrutiny when a video emerged showing officers pepper spraying and violently arresting a 9-year-old black girl. At one point, berating her for, and I'm going to quote here, acting like a child. Not even a month later, officers pepper sprayed and arrested a black mother as she held her young child, an incident which would again put Rochester police in the national spotlight. And then in March, officers of the department shot and killed another black man who appeared to be having a mental health episode. This ongoing, ceaseless wave of controversy has come as Mayor Warren is running for a third term, despite calls for her resignation and an indictment of 2 felony campaign finance charges hanging over her head. Warren's handling of the police department has been a key point of criticism, so perhaps, and in an effort to tamp some of that down, in January, she approved the creation of a new crisis response team, which is currently operating on a pilot basis. But that program is already coming under fire for shortcomings. And during that incident in which Rochester police pepper sprayed a 9-year-old, that's just a difficult sentence to say, but here we are, in which police pepper sprayed a 9-year-old child. In that case, armed police officers were dispatched because they were responding to a 911 call from that girl's mother, who reported that her boyfriend had stolen her car. And the officers at the scene did not call for mental health backup. There was no reason to think this was a mental health call. So this wouldn't have fallen into the category of what would be now a crisis response or mental health context. There's currently no system in place to send the person in crisis team to a call that has been answered by the police. So now for more on the controversy surrounding Rochester's police department and the ongoing fight to overhaul the city's approach to public safety, I'm joined by Stanley Martin, parole and reentry coordinator for Vocal New York, an organizer with Free to People Rock, and a candidate, of course, for Rochester City Council. Stanley, thank you so much for being here.
Yes, thank you for having me.
So it's been quite a year, and I'd like to start out by getting your take on the community's response to all of this violence and controversy and the sort of action we've seen from people in office, apart from the creation of this mental health unit. Can you talk about how the community is feeling right now in Rochester?
As you were going through, the different instances of violence and police brutality in our community, I was struck by this wave of pain and sadness and almost hopelessness to think that for so many months we took to the streets, we wrote tons and tons of, articles and shared people's experiences, all asking for systemic change, and nothing has really changed in the city of Rochester. We know that based on Tyshawn Jones recently being shot and killed while experiencing a mental health crisis. We know that because when the person in crisis team was created, there were missing pieces like, replacing the police with actual mental health counselors. Instead, that has also fallen on deaf ears, and we have police still responding to mental health crises. Just 2 days ago, a man was outside a Stop Asian Hate protest, and we saw him handcuffed with 5 police officers standing around, and he was clearly identified to be having a mental health crisis. So we see the problem as something that we have to take on by replacing Lovely Warren with someone who actually cares about the community and is not and hasn't been involved in covering up the murder of a man. Someone who really truly is committed to making the systemic changes we're asking for. The community does still have hope in the sense that we have other candidates running. However, when it comes to working with Lovely or seeing any type of change within her administration, we don't see that happening. Recently, Lovely Warren and City Council passed Executive Order 203, which was required by Governor Cuomo in order to get state funding from the governor's office. And within creating that plan and responding to making systemic changes, Lovely Warren held 2 closed-door meetings, and there was not a plan included to hold officers accountable who had responded to Danielle Prude and Tyshawn Jones and the 9-year-old who was pepper sprayed. So we see so many opportunities coming to make change, and this administration simply ignoring them and continuing with business as usual.
Yeah, it sounds, the reason I gave that warning at the top is I feel like at this point, no one can take anymore. And even as someone sort of reporting here, there's that tension between forcing a viewer to confront the reality of what's going on and not wanting to force people to look at this in the face, but it's happening. It's happening, as you said, right now. Someone having a mental health crisis was standing in handcuffs surrounded by police. I believe you said that was a matter of days ago. So turning toward, response to the lack of action by officials. I understand you recently filed a lawsuit accusing Rochester officials of allowing a culture of racist police brutality and asking the court to force the city to reform. Can you talk? And I always give this little request. I'm a lawyer, you're a lawyer. We tend to wonk out on stuff. A lot of our viewers are not lawyers. So if you could explain in very concrete lay terms, like, what should this lawsuit do? What are the actions you are advocating for? What are the fundamental changes that need to be made? And how is this lawsuit going to move Rochester forward?
Absolutely. So this lawsuit really is calling for the support of the federal courts and for the support of the community to demand systemic change in how law enforcement operates in the city of Rochester. For example, I'm one of the plaintiffs, and throughout the protests from May all the way into this year, I was brutalized. I was beaten. I was handcuffed, detained illegally, throughout the protest, shot with pepper spray, rubber bullets. But not only myself, but thousands of people experienced some of this egregious violence. And we think about what happened when the world was watching at these protests. And then we think about what could be happening in these Black and brown neighborhoods when there are no cameras and there are no witnesses. So we were able to find out a study done by a person formerly involved in the Rochester Police Department, who was able to point to years and years of unequal enforcement of the law in Black and brown neighborhoods and a pattern of excessive force in these neighborhoods. So if you're Black and brown in Rochester, there is evidence and data showing you are more likely to experience excessive force, pointing to a pattern of racism in this department. So we are calling on the courts to institute an independent monitor to be able to hold the police accountable. We know they're unable to police themselves, and for years and years, they have just, committed all kinds of acts of violence, which are documented in this lawsuit. And we are saying no more. We're saying enough is enough. We're asking for an independent monitor to ensure that these changes happen, because we know it's not going to happen through Lovely Warren's administration, and it's not going to happen through any police chief trying to hold them accountable. We need more help.
What kind of power would that monitor have? I mean, it sounds like they would have the power to sort of oversee the data about racial bias in enforcement. But I'm wondering, people often use that expression, a few bad apples, while forgetting that it means a few bad apples ruin the bunch. And I'm wondering if that monitor would have hiring and firing power. Would they be able to, reduce police allocation in certain neighborhoods? Like, how much control can a monitor have?
So, when we look at other examples, like in Oakland or New York City, there are the monitors tend to be more focused on changing policy and procedures and trainings, but we also know that's not enough. So, this lawsuit is in tandem with many different strategies, including continuing to organize to replace people who are pro police brutality, pro police violence, with other people who are for the people and would be able to limit the police department's budgets and defund the police essentially. So while we'll have an independent monitor overseeing policy and procedures addressing racism, we will also be organizing to continue to defund the police and instead replace them with a sweeping mental health crisis response that is grounded in, cultural competency, utilizing peers with lived experience, and things along those lines. We know the lawsuit is just one step of many steps to hold police accountable in
About that person in crisis response team. So it sounds to me like it's been very limited so far. My understanding is that unless the person who's picking up the phone to call for help calls 211 instead of 911, the call goes to the police. The reason I raise this is in other jurisdictions that are doing alternate forms of emergency response, whether it's mental health counselor response or civilian response, it all comes from 911. So a person calls 911, the 911 operator says, hey, it sounds like a mental health crisis. I'm going to dispatch mental health experts. But in Rochester, the person who is calling for help is the one who is expected to know the right number to call, which as someone who has had to dial a phone while panicking, like that seems really, really hard and a barrier in and of itself. And of course, once you call 911 and you've called the police, if there is any colorable crime like linked to the person who's having a mental health crisis, the police are going to respond in a police way. And in the Rochester police way, it sounds like that's a very, very violent and frightening form of response. So my question for you is, can this system be salvaged? Could additional funding and changes make this a useful tool? Or is this system just like a hopelessly cosmetic fix?
Based on things that have been implemented by the Warren administration, I do have very real concerns that this is a cosmetic thing to seem like they are actually doing what is needed. There are some good people on the PIC team, like Dr. Lehman Torres, who seems to be taking this very seriously. However, without adequate resources and adequate funding, it's going to fall short. Recently in Rochester, we know there was a man on a bridge who committed suicide holding a baby. And we know the person in crisis team was called. However, they weren't able to respond in adequate time. That points to me to a lack of adequate resources, a lack of adequate funding, and also just a lack of general inclusion of community members who would be able to inform how responses should look. More community input is definitely needed. There needs to be more transparency, and also currently the police chief, Cynthia Harriet Sullivan, is in charge of creating the protocols regarding when the PIC would respond. That's not okay. She is not a mental health expert. She does not, have some of the lived experience that people with different mental health diagnoses may have, or peers or mental health counselors would have. So it should be informed by the community and people who have had some of these experiences, not a police chief. So I'm hopeful that with a change in the administration, there might be more resources and input available. But currently, we see everything done in a very closed door manner, and things seem to be done more to, divert attention from the issues we're facing, not with the intention of making real long-lasting systemic changes.
So when you talk about, that's just like a heartbreaking thing you just described of a person clearly in crisis, clearly in need of help, and help didn't arrive in time. And I'm wondering if when you talk about resource allocation, like could putting a trained staff person in charge of deciding who gets the service help, could streamlining it through 911 increase, could money and staff make this a functional emergency response?
Absolutely, absolutely. We are giving $100 million each year to white men who don't live in the suburbs to come into our communities and terrorize us. It is not a radical or big ask to ask that some of those funds are reallocated to our community members, especially during COVID when we know mental health crises are more common and people are really struggling. So that's all we're asking for when we say defund or reallocate. We're asking to put the money back into our communities and help us to not only survive but thrive in these times.
To your campaign for city council, I'm curious how these issues are coming up in your campaign, how you expect them to play out also in the race for mayor. Like, what are the voter priorities right now as they're deciding who to support?
I think a huge issue is how we get back to normal after COVID. How do we ensure that people have infrastructure and supports, people who are even starting small businesses, people who have mental health issues? How do we continue to expand our housing stock? Those are the main issues I hear from a lot of people, but also one of the biggest issues are public safety and policing. A lot of people they want to know what that means when we say defund and what we mean by reimagine policing. So our campaign is focusing on providing resources to people that make them safe and make them whole and healthy. We know access to mental health, access to quality schools, access to a shelter, and so many different social services allow people to be whole and thrive. So our campaign is going to be focused on ensuring that when we do get into office, we continue to make these resources available, whether it's through defunding the police, whether it's through marijuana tax revenue to create a universal basic income for people below the poverty limit. We are working on the ground with people who have been hit the hardest through COVID, and we're hopeful that we can make the systemic changes that we continue to beg and plead for.
Well, that's some exciting stuff to hear about, some exciting big changes in your campaign. When do voters need to know that your election is happening? When is the race?
Yes.
When is the vote, I mean?
Yes, June 22nd is the primary here in New York State. So look out, June 22nd. We have been knocking on people's doors and really collecting data about the issues that are most important to our community. And time again, it's public safety. What do resources look like to recoup from COVID-19? And we're listening, and we know we are capable of making some of these changes, and we're committed to doing so.
Well, Stanley Martin, thank you so much for joining us here on the Appeal Live, talking about some incredibly difficult subject matter and going through that with us for the sake of our viewers. We really appreciate you coming on here, and I wish you the best of luck in your campaign. Hope you're going to come back and fill us in on what's happening in Rochester before that midsummer date.
Absolutely, and hopefully it would be good news. I mean, people are so resilient in Rochester, and yeah, hopefully it will be good news by then. But thank you so much.
We'll need some good news.
Yes. Thank you.
There you have it, folks. Stanley Martin, who's running in Rochester, talking through some incredibly difficult issues surrounding the shocking misconduct in the Rochester Police Department. This has been another episode of The Appeal Live. You can find us on Facebook or Twitter. I'm Emily Galvin Almanza. Thank you so much for joining us.